They taught me to keep my face empty, like a blank screen that could reflect whatever the room needed. Smile when required, look surprised when required. Nodding became my second language. For years, I measured my life in the little micro-decisions that meant survival. What to say on a call, which names to write down or cross out, when to sip my drink slow and when to swallow rapidly and move on. My real name no longer matters. The agency gave me one that fitted dossier, a credit card, a neat file, but it never fit in a pocket or at a bar. For the rest of the world, I was an investment consultant, one of those polished men and women who could make spreadsheets sound like lullabies and markets look inevitable. For my handlers, I was the quiet type who listened to numbers and listened to people. For myself, I was a man who learned early that the truth had many shades, and usually none of them were pleasant. It was the late 90s when they came for me. The world felt like a place of small miracles then, startups erupting into overnight fortunes, new currencies, new power. I was young, hungry, and dangerously certain I could beat algorithms with intuition. An email that seemed like a client inquiry arrived on a Thursday. It asked for a risk assessment of a small fund routing transactions through a chain of shell companies in the Caribbean. I replied with the kind of bored courtesy I gave to 70 emails a day. By Saturday, I had a meeting in a room that smelled faintly of lemon polish and old money. The man across the table slid a business card that carried no corporate logo, only a name and a number. It was that number that would slowly begin to erode everything I thought I knew about my life. He spoke in casual phrases that sounded like casual threats. "We need someone who can listen without being visible," he said. "Someone who knows where the money is and who will not blink when they see the shadows." I thought I knew what shadows meant back then. I thought it meant tax evasion, shell games, corporate greed. I thought wrong. Recruitment, as they taught me, is not an act of force. It is a seduction of usefulness. They did not bind me with threats. They bound me with the idea of being necessary, to protect, to preserve, to keep careful eyes on the parts of the world that were allowed to remain messy. There was a moral sheen to the story they offered. We were preventing chaos by watching those who would weaponize money, a tidy pretext that removed questions and left only a job. My first months were absurdly mundane. I learned code words and memorized who in the bank laughed too loudly at certain jokes. I traveled to small hotels where people in power signed documents in ink and retired with no one noticing how much they had signed away. The first real test, however, came in the form of an innocuous spreadsheet, an innocent list of accounts that hid a pattern. It was in that pattern that I saw the first thread that would unravel other threads. There were normal transactions, consulting fees, small real estate purchases, then sudden, neat flows of capital extinguishing into accounts with names that did not correspond to people. Those accounts were nodes, and the nodes connected to places I had only seen in late-night documentaries, remote airstrips, companies that existed on little more than a fax line, laboratories the news anchors never visited. I flagged the pattern, sent the encrypted report as instructed, and thought nothing of it. 5 days later, my handler called me in the middle of the night. He said simply, "Come in." The office was quiet, lit like a stage. My report was on the table, but someone had annotated it in a handwriting that felt like a palm pressed to the back of the neck. My handler did not speak of the numbers. He spoke of consequence. "This is not merely money," he said. "There is an architecture here. People you will meet will be wearing suits or polos or lab coats. They are all part of a catalog. And some things in that catalog are not meant for markets." I had actually heard the sentence before, in spy novels and conspiracy podcasts. But here it was real. in the phone call, and the lemon-scented room, some things were not meant for markets. I was assigned a cover, the investment consultant who advised a string of Midwestern clients on how to optimize tax positions. I rented a nice apartment with a balcony I barely used, my inbox filled with appointments, cocktail hours, introductions. I became charming by force. I learned to say that investors wanted solid returns, low risk, no fuss. All the while, I began receiving strange requests from people with ordinary neckties, an invitation to a private dinner with a trustee, a casual ask to audit the books of a charity, a suggestion to attend an anniversary meeting for a boutique trust. At first, they seemed like the typical strange things of high finance. Then, I began to notice a different pattern. People who had everything, billion-dollar stakes, cities named in their retirement funds, visited places they never publicly mentioned. My spreadsheets collected odd geotags. A philanthropist in Manhattan suddenly took a business trip to a base in an unmarked desert. A CEO shuttered a factory and then bought a research vessel. These were moves that made no sense in market logic. Hart entered my life at one of those dinners. He was older than his papers claimed and had a laugh like a lock turning. There are men who enter a room and seem to chew the air. Hart was one of those. He asked the right questions in the wrong order, revealing that he knew my cover and seemed to enjoy the theater of my discomfort. "You'll make a fine analyst," he said. "But tell me, do you like to look behind doors?" Behind doors. Words folded into themselves. In my life as a consultant, I had looked behind plenty of doors, client ledgers, earnings reports. Behind some doors in Hart's world, people kept things that did not belong in ledgers. I smiled because I had been practicing that smile for weeks. 2 months into my assignment, I was shown an image that would never leave me. It did not appear in the reports. It arrived as a single frame on an encrypted hard drive, and it was presented to me in a windowless room, the kind designed to make your own heartbeat sound too loud. The photograph was grainy, a field under a low moon, an object like a gleaming, dirty silver coin half buried in the dirt, and around it strange footprints that were not quite human. The photograph had been taken in a remote area of the Southwest, a place of government leases and private contracts. The tag on the file read, "Ascertainment, Project Prometheus." If you imagine that encountering the possibility of extraterrestrial life would be cinematic, music swelling, your breath catching, then you must never have been trained to observe. My reaction was administrative. I noted the file name, the coordinates, the date. Inside my head, a list formed of who had been present at the operation, the logistics that would have enabled a cover-up, the bank transactions that paid for night flights and unmarked trucks. Someone, somewhere, had rigidly planned to make this remain a secret. Our agency framed it as a national security problem. We watched market movements that followed artifacts and sightings as if they were currency. Private holdings suddenly cut off funding to certain universities. A biotech firm received a grant it had not applied for and quietly redirected its research priorities. In essence, the world bent around this unspoken variable. Money, always useful, became the hand that smoothed inconvenient questions. How do you live while carrying that knowledge? How do you market yourself at lunch when, in private, you help manage the flow of silence? I learned to sleep like a man who had promised something to someone but could not remember whether the promise was made in good faith. I learned to be patient. And more than anything, I learned to make tiny, careful choices to protect myself. The agency was not monolithic.
There were factions, men and women in gray suits with differing philosophies. Some pushed for transparency in their private conversations, believing that some pieces of information could be managed publicly, explained away as advanced technology or misidentified natural phenomena. Others argued for an iron lid. "The public is not equipped," one senior officer said to me once, lighting a cigar as if details needed ash to fall. "We are caretakers. You keep the lid." That one sentence doubled as a justification for sleeping in rooms with the lights on. There is a point at which compartmentalization becomes a prison. I was allowed to know only the sections needed to do my job. The rest was handled by other cells. Archivists, scientists, contractors, but fragments seep. A chat overheard in a hallway, a mislabeled ledger, a pattern of grants for research projects that never published. I began to catalog these inconsistencies like an archivist of impossible things. The more I cataloged, the more I felt the world tilt. There were nights when I would be in the office, alone at 3 a.m., watching footage of strange aerial phenomena, the raw sight of lights behaving like tiny clockwork machines that refused to obey conventional motion. I watched documents that referenced reverse engineering protocols and foreign materials analysis. I translated jargon into human terms. We had apparently found things that did not originate on our planet, and someone had decided that the consequences of announcing such facts outweighed any moral argument for disclosure. And then there were the euphemisms that made the whole operation look like a boardroom memo. Asset integration, experimental acquisition, stakeholder stabilization. One of my tasks, simple on paper, was to ensure that companies working on suspicious projects received the necessary philanthropic funds without creating a traceable path. It is incredible how complicit banks can become when instructed politely. And so I learned the elegant obscenity of funneling money towards silence. I worked cases that involved private labs whose research would later be labeled as defense. I shadowed shipments that looked like industrial equipment but were cataloged as agricultural. I sat in rooms where technicians argued loudly and scientifically about materials that expanded and contracted according to patterns no earthly alloy should obey. These were the corners of power where my role made sense, the quiet one with the spreadsheets who could obscure and justify with the calm voice of financial reason. But the deeper I went, the more fragile the scaffolding became. People made mistakes. A private contractor left a GPS-enabled device in the back of a truck. A research paper leaked as an internal memo. A senator received a curious donation that arrived in cash and was not listed in any public filing. Each error was a fissure, and the fissures accumulate. My personal life withered. I traded lovers for aliases, dates for dead drops, friendship for coordinate exchanges. People asked why I had grown distant. I learned to craft answers that sounded reasonable and to make my eyes do the rest. When I met others, operatives with their own stories, they spoke in the kind of black humor that keeps sane men breathing. "If you want to understand the world," one whispered in a bar, the neon lights making tearless eyes glitter, "you learn the difference between being dangerous and being useful." The night I realized I could never walk back through my old life was not cinematic. It was a Tuesday. I was in an unmarked building reading an internal audit that compared funding flows for research labs with meteorological anomalies. The spreadsheet had a column marked with a code I had not seen before: Primus. I traced Primus through cross-references and found a list of meetings. At the top of the list, a single name appeared repeatedly: Hart. I looked up to see a photograph of Hart smiling with men in lab coats. It was dated 2 weeks before the artifact recovery image. In the photograph, Hart's hand rested on an object in a case, polished, black, and humming in a way that photographs do not usually hum. Someone's handwriting had annotated the margin. Stabilize and monetize. Monetize. Of all the words in the lexicon of my life, that one hit like a fist. Someone had assigned value to the incomprehensible. The work I had been doing, laundering money, sealing deals, making excuses, was not merely about the usual corruptions of power. It had become architecture for something larger. If secrets were currency, then alien artifacts were the most precious commodity of all. That was the moment when my training and my conscience had their first private war. My training told me silence. My conscience began to whisper a new question. Silence for whom? For the security of nations, or for the security of people with more money than ethics? The job that followed was the sort that spends people. I was told to construct the financial scaffolding for a new project, an initiative that would integrate private resources, charitable funds, and corporate willingness into a single cage. It had a name, a budget, and a list of contractors. It had legal opinions that read like prayers and non-disclosure agreements that could ruin a person's life if they tried to speak. My job was simple: make the money look legitimate. At a Thursday meeting, Hart looked at me as if I were a child with a coin. He said, "Make it neat. Make it patriotic." I looked at the coin. I put it, finally, into my pocket. By the time I left the building that night, the city appeared slightly off-kilter, as if somebody had shifted part of its skyline 20 centimeters east. I walked faster than usual because speed is another language of leaving. I had signed off on the initial ledger. My hands smelled faintly of lemon and printer toner. I did not know then that the ledger would grow into a ledger of nations. I only knew with the certainty that arrives late but refuses to be ignored, that I would no longer be able to pretend ignorance when cranes lifted crates in the desert and when private jets landed with sealed manifests. The world I was living in was a house with doors that opened onto rooms no one was supposed to know existed. And if you, the listener, think this sounds like a fever dream swapped for a paycheck, I will only say this: I have the receipts. Not the ones journalists print to win awards, but receipts that live in the habits of men. Late-night wire transfers, the sudden redirection of research funds, the pattern of philanthropy tied to darkness. These are the signs you do not see until someone points them out. The first part of my story ends on a small and quiet cliff, the kind that sneaks up on you. I was recruited, I had learned to live under a cover, and I had seen evidence that suggested we were not alone in the universe, and I had been asked to monetize that evidence. The coin in my pocket had been cataloged. It had a price and a buyer. I had agreed in a way that felt both pragmatic and damned. The hook is simple. I realized too late that some secrets, once cataloged as assets, demand payment in more than money. They ask for complicity, for silence, and sometimes for sacrifice. The ledger was only the beginning. The next phase, when I would be forced to choose between truth and survival, was already writing itself. If you are still listening, then know this: the rest of what I will tell you cannot be understood as merely black or white. It is a map of gray. It is a record of people doing what they believed was necessary and people doing what they believed would make them untouchable. And in the middle of that map, I stood, a man with a ledger, a coin in his pocket, and the sound of a name that promised to change everything: Hart.
I never thought I would sit in front of a camera, speaking to people I have never met, telling them secrets I once swore to take to the grave. But life has a strange way of forcing you to choose between silence that kills you from within and words that might set you free. My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is the life I once lived, as an operative working inside an American intelligence network where every handshake could be a trap and every smile could hide a knife. It was the late 90s when they came for me. The Cold War was over, but new battles had already begun. Battles fought not with bombs or tanks, but with money, information, and influence. My cover story was simple. I was an investment consultant. On the surface, I helped corporations manage risk, predict market trends, and shuffle billions of dollars across the globe. In reality, I was following the money, tracing invisible rivers of cash that often flowed into places no one dared to mention publicly. I thought intelligence work was glamorous. In truth, it was endless paperwork, sleepless nights, and the constant paranoia that your best friend today might become your executioner tomorrow. Recruitment was not an act of force, it was seduction. They told me I could be useful, that I could help protect the world by tracking those who abused financial systems. And I believed them, at least at first. One day, I was shown a grainy photograph that would haunt me forever. A field under a low moon, an object half buried in the dirt, metallic and not of human design. Around it were strange footprints, not quite human either. The file was labeled Artifact Recovery, Project Prometheus. From that day on, I knew I was not just chasing money, I was chasing shadows of something bigger, something the world was never meant to see. The mask of the consultant became second nature. I had a LinkedIn profile, fake articles, and clients who saw me as the man who could predict storms in the markets. They never realized I was tracking storms in the skies. I was briefed on the Prometheus program, a project dedicated to recovering and studying objects of non-terrestrial origin. They never used the word alien, too dangerous, too destabilizing. Instead, they spoke in clinical terms: samples, artifacts, assets. My role was not scientific. I was the accountant of silence. I funneled billions through shell companies, hid research budgets inside philanthropic grants, and made impossible projects look like ordinary investments. Hart was always there: mentor, rival, threat. He once told me, "The truth is not liberating. It is destabilizing. People don't want freedom. They want safety. We give them safety by hiding what they cannot handle." I wanted to believe him, but the more I saw, the harder it became. My partner Mark was the only one I trusted, until the day he betrayed me. He stole files, not just numbers, but proof. Photographs, transcripts, material samples. For weeks, I followed his ghost across cities. Then he sent me one message: "We both know secrets belong to no one." And then he vanished. The agency tightened its grip on me. Hart watched me more closely. I realized trust was an illusion. In our world, survival was not about loyalty. It was about usefulness. I began to see more than I was meant to see. Reports from Ukraine describing a crash site, villagers silenced, biological samples secured. Documents about underground labs in Nevada and Poland where fragments were studied and technologies quietly stolen. And then the footage: lights moving at impossible speeds, craft hovering over bases, and one recording I will never forget: a figure on a table, humanoid but not human, skin translucent, eyes black and unblinking. A scientist whispered, "Not dead, only dormant." That night, I realized we were not only hiding artifacts, we were hiding beings. My last assignment revealed the machinery behind the curtain. I was placed inside a network that didn't just manipulate money, it manipulated nations. The stock market was not a game of chance. It was a lever. With the right pressure, governments could be toppled, wars ignited, scandals buried. And at the core of this machine was alien technology. Algorithms derived from reverse-engineered systems predicted human behavior with terrifying accuracy. Entire populations could be nudged, pacified, or inflamed, not by force, but by invisible economic pressure. Hart told me once, "The greatest illusion is democracy. People think they choose, but choices are manufactured.
We don't steal freedom, we sell alternatives. The breaking point came when I stumbled across a file mislabeled as a routine audit. Inside was video footage. A being lay on a table, not quite dead, not quite alive. Tubes and machines kept it in some kind of stasis. Around it, scientists argued in hushed tones. The file was stamped with one word: classified. Primus. I could no longer be silent. Years have passed. I live under names that change with the seasons. I move often, stay nowhere too long. But the silence has grown unbearable. I can no longer carry this alone. So I tell my story, not for glory, not for revenge, but because the world deserves to know. You believe the world you see is stable, that governments guide nations, that markets rise and fall naturally, that science marches forward through human genius alone. That is the illusion. Behind the curtain are secrets that would shatter everything you believe. That we are not alone, that fragments of alien technology are woven into the devices you use every day, that wars are started and ended by invisible financial levers, that freedom itself is scripted, bought and sold by men like Hart who believe they are caretakers of humanity. Maybe you will dismiss this as fiction, another conspiracy theory lost in the noise of the internet. But remember this: the most effective secrets are the ones hidden in plain sight, disguised as stories too wild to believe. I was an agent once. Now, I am just a man with a confession. And if you are hearing this, it means one thing: the lid is starting to crack. I planned my escape in secret. Fake passports, caches of money, routes mapped with paranoid precision. On my last night in Washington, I burned everything: files, photos, even the suit that had become my armor. The flames smelled like chemicals and regret. When the sun rose, I was no longer an agent. I was a ghost.